What's good, mini crafters? My name's Samuel, and I have a question for you. Have you ever heard of a creature called a bobbit worm? If not, totally fine. If you have, I want to know what corner of the internet you're hanging out in, and how the heck do I get invited? Regardless, I'm going to be making an awesome giant worm for this mine diorama. Cue the intro. Whoa, wrong intro. Right theme, wrong intro. So a couple weeks ago, I'm casually browsing when without my permission, my eyes are assaulted by an image of an article about the bobbit worm. If you don't know, bobbit worms are predatory worms that make their home in seabeds and can grow up to 10 feet long. Now, I've never seen a bobbit worm, but I am a big movie fan, and when I saw this picture, it immediately made me think of the awful worms from the 2005 King Kong movie. And if you know what I'm talking about, you're absolutely shaking your head trying to forget that awful scene. So, naturally, I thought I'd make a mine diorama of some unfortunate souls running into one of these big baddies. I want this diorama to be a cutaway view of a mine so that you can look at it from the side and see all the spooky goodness within. To help with the layout of the tunnels, I'm going to need my little worm friend, who I will be naming and providing a story for later on. I found this nasty STL file of this gross looking worm on My Mini Factory. I'll have it linked below if you're interested in checking it out. I'm going to be using my worm to give me a rough idea of the dimensions that I need for this part. For the rest of the tunnels, I'm going to have my little guys, who I'll also talk about later on and give them a backstory as well, but I'm going to use them and pencil in where I want the mine tunnels to be on the outer layer of the foam. I'm then going to tape the two foam layers together, leaving the third intact and uncut. I then use my hot wire foam cutter to cut out the foam sections that I need to remove. Once that's done, I lay my foam pieces back on that third untouched foam layer, and this is where you can really start to see the shape of the mine coming together. Before gluing the pieces of the foam to the back layer, I'm going to be using my hot wire tool to make a recessed space for the electronics to go in later. Oh yeah, we're going to light this baby up. I also had to get a little bit creative with the spot where the worm was going to be bursting out of the tunnel. Since he's a little bit weirdly shaped, I had to cut into the tunnel side a little bit. The good thing here is this is going to allow me to show off all of his great, gross details a bit better. And later on, I'm going to add the rubble and rock debris to the base of the area to not only hide where I'm going to connect the worm to the tunnel, but also show the explosion of him bursting into the tunnel. Once all my foam pieces are glued together, I'm going to then glue each of those sections to the back piece of foam. I work carefully to ensure that everything is lined up nicely. And once everything's glued down, I can begin to work on texturing up the mine tunnels themselves. To start, I'm going to be using a different type of tip on my hot wire foam cutter tool to begin to carve up the interior of the mine. I'm trying to make it look like it's all stone that's been carved away with pickaxes, dynamite, and other mining tools. Once the texturing is done, the last step with the foam layers is to glue them all to the wooden base. With all of the foam layers together and the interior textured up, I can't forget about the surface above the mine. To help create a more natural, gradual ground, I once again take my hot wire foam cutter tool and I'm going to slice that down a bit to give it a bit more visual interest. I then construct a simple little wooden platform that I'm going to have a little A-frame sitting on. My plan here is to have a little winch box structure that I'll string a cable from and connect to the A-frame piece. Then from there, the cable will feed down into the mine to an elevator. This is going to let the survivors get to the various levels of the mine. I end up cutting a little slit out of the middle for the cable to feed through down to the elevator. Speaking of the elevator, that's also going to be made out of balsa wood, and I'm going to have the two sides open so that people can enter or exit on either side into the mine tunnels. I take two cross beams and lay those down on a few cut up planks of wood to make the elevator floor. I'm then constructing the sides out of thin wood beams glued together, and then I add that to the floor piece. Before I seal any of the foam ahead of painting, I need to add the wooden support beams to the mine tunnels. I'm just taking some balsa wood and chopping that up into little beams that fit the dimensions of the tunnel. I then use some tacky glue and get those into position. The last step before sealing everything up is making the rock explosion where the worm is bursting into the tunnel. I take a pile of cork bits and I use that as earth and rubble around where the worm is going to be. I start to pile the rubble up around the outline so that when I place him in the tunnel, it's going to look like he's just burst out of the ground. I hit the pile of cork with some isopropyl alcohol and then some of my homemade scenic glue, and I let that cure. Once dry, I can seal all the foam up before I start painting. To seal everything, I'm mixing up a bit of raw umber acrylic paint with some matte Mod Podge and then diluting that mix with some water. This is going to give me a nice thin sealant that I can then paint into all the nice rock texture on the walls. This is a thinner consistency, which is letting me preserve all of the nice detail and textures. Once the mine walls are painted and sealed up, I then add some plaster to that previous mix, which is going to thicken it up. And from there, I can apply that everywhere else that I see the green foam. I'm adding it to the floors of the mine tunnels as well as the surface area too. This is going to let me seal any gaps, build up a slight terrain, and it gets everything ready for some dirt and debris. With the terrain paste still wet, I add a variety of small, medium, and large ballast rocks to the mine floors at the base of the walls. This distribution of rubble is going to help create a more realistic surface texture. I'm going to do the same thing for the surface, focusing the biggest rubble around the shack and the platform. Once I have all the rubble in place, I break out my isopropyl alcohol and homemade scenic glue. I'm distributing both with dropper bottles on the surface to avoid any overspray on the shack, but in the mine tunnels, I'm going to switch to spray bottles to help evenly coat everything. With the paste down and dry, I add a little weird looking plant and egg thing that both of my scientists are going to be scanning and looking at. I also add a guitar string cable going from the winch box to the little A-frame that I made, and then it's going to lead down into the mine shaft. I glue that cable in place, but I'm going to leave the elevator unglued as I want to prime that separately to ensure that I evenly coat everything. And with the mine structure done, including the earth explosion, the wooden beams, the texturing on the walls, and the terrain paste being dried, I'm able to come in and prime everything up. Once primed, I'm starting with the walls and the mine tunnels below ground first. I'm painting this up in a deep brown color since this is mostly dirt and earth. And while I'm being mindful of getting paint on the wooden beam structures, it's really not that big of a deal if I do, because I'm going to be going over those in a few moments and I'll be able to cover up any mistakes that I've made. For all the wooden support beams and the elevator, I only hit them with a base coat of Vallejo's flat earth, which actually does the job of differentiating the wood beams from the dark brown mine walls. Next comes the surface painting. The wooden platform and the winch shack get a lighter wood color of Vallejo's dark sand mixed with some of that flat earth color. This is going to change the feel of the dusty, drier wood on the surface when you compare it to the darker, moisture-filled mines. The ground is super easy to do, and it just requires a splotchy base coat of both warm gray and Vallejo's dark sand. I apply both colors and blend them while both are still wet with a sponge and a huge paintbrush. Then once that paint is dry, I take some tacky glue and I place a few brown tufts around to convey a dry environment with some semblance of foliage. The last step down in the mines is to add some lights. And to start, I'm going to be drilling and poking some holes in the walls so that I can feed some LED wires through. I did some LED work in my last video where I ended up making a real spell for a beholder to be casting. And I want to do something with LEDs again. If you're interested in seeing how I ended up making that real spell using LEDs, be sure to check out that video, which I'll have linked below. With the holes drilled, I can feed the wires through to the back of the diorama for easy wiring. This is why I made that recessed cutout into the back layer of foam. This allows me to have room to store the battery housing, all of the wiring, and anything else that I need to make sure this mine lights up correctly. I'm using a basic 9-volt battery pack to light up a total of 7 LED lights. I connect all of the positives and all of the negatives, and then I wire that to the battery pack. I'm being sure to test the circuit often to ensure that I'm not missing anything and to ensure that there's no disconnect. And that is the mine done. Now I'm going to move on to painting the worm and the scientists, and while I do that, let me give you a little bit of background for them. I initially thought that I would have some miners working in this mine, and that's what drew the giant worm in. But I had a few of these ecologists or scientists and this little heavy gunner guy from a previous project that I had decided to scrap. I ended up using them for this project instead. These little guys live in the apocalyptic world that I've made a few projects in. The two ecologists, Darwin and Jane, decided to go below ground so that they could do some scanning and take some samples from the area. Supposedly, this is where the legendary giant worms like to burrow, and the mucus that they produce and leave behind in their burrowing tunnels is quite valuable in the apocalyptic trade towns. However, they're no fools, and they're aware that the frequency of their scanners draw in the mutated worms. So, they hired a mercenary gunman, Gunther, to accompany them into the mine just in case things go south. All was going smoothly, but about 20 minutes into their work, Darwin noticed the telltale sign and rumble of a mutated worm drawing nearer. But what they didn't expect was Slippery Steve. Slippery Steve is not just a big mutant worm, he's a legendary, huge mutant worm. Known for being particularly elusive, Slippery Steve is all but a myth. And as anyone knows in the apocalypse, fighting and maybe killing a myth makes you a myth. So, Darwin and Jane are scanning, Slippery Steve explodes into the mine, ready to eat both of them, and then Gunther the mercenary is going to be dessert. Slippery Steve threatens to cause a cave-in as the Great Worm continues to fill the mine tunnel. Gunther grimaces as he sees the worm's various veins pulsing and the pustules oozing, likely at the thought of a fresh meal, and his awful maw opens, showing rows of sharp teeth. Gunther fires up his modified handheld Gatling gun, and he is not about to go down without a fight. What an awesome diorama, you guys. I am genuinely thrilled with how this turned out. I think the cutaway view looks really cool, and it definitely fits well into my apocalyptic world. But what do you guys think? Was this a cool diorama? Is there something that you would have changed or added? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're commenting, be sure to hit that little subscribe button and the little bell so that you're notified when the newest Minecraft video drops. If you want to support the channel, there are a few different things that you can do. You can share this video with your hobby nerd friends. You can subscribe if you haven't already, and you can now pick up some of the supplies and tools that I use using the links down below. Those are Amazon affiliate links, and if you use them, the channel gets a little bit of kickback at no extra cost to you. That's going to do it for this one, you guys. Until next time, keep on crafting.